My name is Harriet. I'm a long-term volunteer, which for me means I'm here at the mountain, 2 to 5 months a year for the last 15 years. The first thing I'd like to introduce you to is the trees. You'll notice that they are oak trees. They're white oaks, you can tell because they have rounded lobes. Red oaks, which you'll see more down at the bottom, have very pointy lobes. Now, when I first saw these trees, all kind of hunkered down, I thought they were like the Texas scrub oak that I used to know, maybe 100, 150 years old. But no, these are white oaks. White oaks normally, same acorn, planted at the base of the mountain next to the stream with good soil, grow up 80 to 100 feet and then have their crown. These poor things are living up here in about this much soil, acidic at that, and subject to our winter winds. So they have adapted. They have learned to hunker down and pretend they're rhododendron so that the winds sweep over them. They grow very slowly under these adverse conditions. And so here is a cut from an average-sized tree. So we sent this to the Division of Forestry at Clemson University. They know how to count rings. You see how very, very tight the rings are. Usually they're much bigger, 1 ring per year. They counted these rings and said this tree was 420 years old when it died, okay? So the average age of all these trees on the top of the mountain is around 300 to 600 years old. We used to call them dwarf white oaks. Now we're told to call them wind-sheared white oaks. And to the best of our knowledge, if it's not the only such grove in the United States, it's certainly the largest because, as you will see, it covers the entire top of the mountain. Okay, let's meet out on Meditation Rock. We are on Meditation Rock, one of the sacred spaces, we like to call it, on the mountain. Campers have their final group hugs here. People get married here. Lovely space. You're at 4,200 feet, as it said on the sign. Blue Valley is 2,000 feet down below. The rock you're standing on, as you see, is granite. The little sparkly things are mica. My friends in Colorado and California get annoyed or sneer when I talk about our beautiful mountains and how high they are, because of course the Rockies are much, much higher. But what they don't know, and you now know, is that these mountains, when they were young, were higher than the Himalayas are now. It's just that they're very old, and like us, they've been weathering and shrinking a bit with erosion. So here we are. It's still a gorgeous mountain view. It's softer than the Rockies, but it's got its own kind of beauty. Let's move over to the lodge now. Okay, so here we are with much the same view, but this is the front porch for the folks who live in the lodge. That mountain over there is Chinkapin. We're on Little Scaly, by the way. That's Chinkapin. We are surrounded on 3 sides by Nantahala National Forest. Our trails join the trails for the National Forest, which means I can lead a hike down Little Scaly and up Chinkapin and around to its many lookout spaces. Over yonder, at night, you will see a whole bunch of lights. That's Clemson. They tell me that in the winter, when it's really, really crisp, or the late fall, and there's a football game, you can actually see the lights of the football field outlined. But you will not see many lights in the immediate neighborhood because, as I say, it's all national forest. Let's move on now. All right, let's pause here for just a moment. I want you to notice this building cabin called Emerson. It's the only cabin on the mountain that is a full house. It has a full kitchen, a real living room, 2 bedrooms with a total of 5 beds, and 1.5 baths. People, when we don't have a program, like to rent this cabin, bring their own food, and have a personal retreat. Emerson, as in Ralph Waldo Emerson, another cabin named Walden for Henry David Thoreau's book. Those of you who are UUs will recognize your spiritual ancestors in these names. Okay, let's continue. Look inside this rhododendron bush, and you will see a rather large white oak that's in very good, happy living condition. We think this is the oldest one on the mountain, and we guess, based on its size compared to the one I showed you, that it's around 600 years old. So some people call it grandfather or grandmother white oak, but there it is. Look at that oak. You see how its middle is missing? You can see that it was hit by lightning once upon a time. Doesn't seem to have stopped its being very happy. As you may know, the sap, the fluid, what you'd call the lifeblood of a tree, goes up in something called the phloem, P-H-L-O-E-M, that's just under the bark. So as long as you don't girdle the tree, you don't stop the sap from going up, and so it lives. I love the metaphor here. Keep going in spite of adversity. Life wants to live. Here's another example of the same thing. You can see where it was destroyed, except it's not been destroyed because it just keeps on growing and thriving. We love it. And over here is my favorite poster child for the white oaks and the way they hunker down. I think its gnarly curves are just gorgeous. All right, as you can see, again, you know that the chalice is your symbol. This building was originally designed to be a chapel, and we still call it the chapel. However, by the time it got built, our community had grown to where we couldn't house it in here, so it's never had our services, which are usually over in the great room or the tree house. But it is still a lovely building. We use it for breakout spaces. When a large group wants to split into smaller groups, they spread out into the library and into White Oak, into different spaces, and this can be one of them. There can be a table and chairs and easels, or as you see, it can be a yoga studio. I have done music. Again, we put music stands and chairs, and have what I called my sight reading sinfonietta. The acoustics in here are lovely. So it's just a lovely, warm feeling space called the chapel. Okay, you are now standing on the Eastern Continental Divide. Usually people think of Continental Divide as meaning the western one, where the Rockies, one side, water will go down to the Pacific, the other side it will eventually drain to the Mississippi. But there's also an Eastern Continental Divide, and you're standing on it. You will also see signs for it on many of the roads as you drive around this area. But right here, if water gets spilled off the Commons deck and goes that way, it's going to drain eventually to the Chattooga River and fairly straight out to the Atlantic. If, on the other hand, it goes off the kitchen side of the dining hall or down this way, it's going to go into our little creek, which will join Turtle Pond Creek, which will go down to join the Colasaja in Highlands, that one will flow to join the Little Tennessee River. The Little Tennessee River wanders around and eventually joins the main Tennessee River. The Tennessee River, as you may or may not know, goes down past Chattanooga, goes south into Alabama all the way to Guntersville, turns around at an escarpment, and goes all the way back up north to join the Ohio River between Kentucky and Ohio, which flows out to the Mississippi and out to the Gulf. Continental Divide, Eastern version. Okay, now let's talk about the tower. This tower is the third incarnation of what was originally an acting fire tower. The first two incarnations burned down, but this one is almost exactly the same in size and height and so on. You can climb it. The railings and stairs are good. At the top, you will see little plaques in the railing that tell you what mountain you're looking at. On a really nice day, you're going to be looking at both North and South Carolina, Georgia, and the furthest mountain over to the west will be in Tennessee. Now, a little history. This mountain was first turned into a camp in the early 1900s by a family named Parry. If your name is Parry, what do you call your camp? Camp Paradise, of course. Maud Parry thought that Southern young ladies needed to know a few things besides how to wear white gloves and hold a teacup or a mint julep properly. She wanted them to learn survival skills just like their Boy Scout brothers were learning. So the girls came by train to Dillard and then by horse and buggy from Dillard, the 10 miles up to here. Their baggage followed in a mule cart, and up here they lived in tents. The only building on the property at first was the central room in what is now called the Ascender building. That was the kitchen where she made food. Otherwise, everything they did was outdoors. Eventually, you have a version of this history, a longer version, somewhere around page 8 or so of the white notebook that you will find in your room or cabin. The short version, however, is that eventually she's going to sell it. It's going to become a boys' camp, then a co-ed camp, then I think a boys' camp again. We, the Mountain Retreat, take the mountain and turn it into the place we all love in 1979. So this year we're on our 41st year. We made a big celebration of our 40th anniversary and are looking forward to many more. However, backing up, Maud Parry. I know some of these stories because her grandson used to come up here as a little boy, 9, 10, 11, 12, with her other grandchildren, and this was their backyard. They played here. He loved what we have done with the mountain and became a major donor and also for several years a member of our board of trustees. He lives way out west, however, so he doesn't get back here very often, but I was lucky enough to be here when he did a PowerPoint presentation showing lots of photos and telling lots of stories from the old days that he remembers. And one of them is, the one I'm going to tell you is kind of fun. The time came when Maud decided that it was time to sell. She was getting too old to run this. So she talked to the real estate people and said, what do I have to do to sell it? And the first thing they said was, you got to pave that road, which up till now was nothing but a dirt track that the horses and mules could come on. And one of the, okay, fine. But one of the obstacles was that down near what is now the dining hall, there was a sharp curve, and in the middle of it was a stump. The tree had been cut down, but the stump was still there, and it was quite large. To go around it would have meant cutting down a whole bunch more trees, and they didn't want to do that, and it would have made the road sharper turn. So they wanted to get the stump out. So the menfolk took their shovels and tried. Wasn't going to happen. We already had an Ace Hardware down in Highlands. We're now talking the 40s or so. So they went down and talked with measurements of what they had to deal with. And the man said, okay, you're going to have to dynamite, no question. From what you're showing me, you need half a stick of dynamite. I can't sell you a half a stick of dynamite. I can only sell you a whole stick of dynamite. But I'm telling you, you really only need to use half of that stick, okay? Well, you know how it goes. Americans, more has got to be better, right? Can you see where this story is going? So Laird, as I say, at this point was a young'un, watching the menfolk do all this. At first, you know, they dug enough to get a fuse under there. They lit the fuse, everybody stood back. Nothing happened. Eventually, there got to be a little shuddering under the ground. Let's move further back. And eventually, that stump flew over the tower, from the dining hall area over the tower, and landed just a few feet, about 6 or 10 feet from where Maud was making applesauce in her kitchen. Had it landed on top of her, it could have been dangerous with that kind of momentum, but there it is. Okay, before we go see the remains of that stump, I want to tell you one more thing about Maud. She was a woman ahead of her time in many ways. First, with this girls' camp, which taught survival skills. Second, she had a couple of women friends who were a lesbian couple. Try to imagine looking for an apartment or a house in the South in the early part of the 1900s. It wasn't going to happen. Well, she had decided she wanted to build something anyway to bring her grandchildren up. She built, remember I told you to remember Emerson? She built Emerson minus the back room that was added later. She built Emerson and told her friends, you guys go traveling for the summer. For 2 months, I want to have my grandkids up here. The rest of the year, it's yours. I would like to have known Maud Parry. All right, let's move on. The kitchen was that window, and Maud was cooking applesauce, so the story goes. And according to Laird, one of these is real. He thinks that this is the leftover of that stump. It doesn't look so impressive now, but it was 80 years ago or thereabouts, 80, 85 years ago that thing flew over the tower. And that's what happens to stuff out in nature. It decomposes, but it hasn't moved. He's convinced that that's the remains of the stump he saw fly. Every house has to have its kind of sloppy backyard where the maintenance and stuff happens. So here we are, we have our woodshed. Those two buildings are maintenance buildings. And over here, this low concrete structure houses our reservoir, which brings up the question of our water. Water comes down as rain, filters through the rocks and the dirt down to the base of the mountain, where it comes up as several springs, and there are some spring houses down at the base in the vicinity of the craft barn and where the chickens are and so on. So the water comes up from the springs, gets pumped up to the reservoir, and then pumped to all our buildings. So it's electricity that you're paying for when you get water here, but it is very good water because it has done all this natural filtration. And of course, we've made it legal with whatever you have to do to water to make it legal, but it's very good water. Going the other way, a couple of the outlying buildings are still on septic tanks. The main buildings feed a sewer line that goes back down the mountain and we're rather proud of, well, it's several years ago now, but we put in a whole new wastewater treatment system. So the water goes through several fields where the particulates are filtered out. And eventually, when it's deemed ready, it goes through and we, again, do whatever you have to chemically to make sure that we're not putting pollutants into the water. And then it goes down, as I say, to Abe's Creek, which you can walk to, by the way, nice trail. And Abe's Creek eventually runs into the Chattooga and then out to the Savannah and the Atlantic Ocean, as I said before. Okay, on we go. Okay, this is what we call Memorial Garden. As you see, there are the names of folks who have been dear to the mountain and to whom the mountain was dear. There used to be fancier plaques that we had thought were going to last, if not forever, for quite a while. However, like that stump, they decayed. And so we have these temporary plaques up, waiting until we decide and have the money for our really permanent installation sometime in the future. I would call your attention, you can become a Memorial Life member by paying a certain amount, and that gives you, or the person you designate, the right to have one of these put up after you pass. Your name will be on the Memorial Life plaques in Heritage Hall or the dining hall as they move. I'd like to call your attention to the flooring we have here. This is relatively new, last few years. It was kind of a muddy mess. The fact is that folks who want to come to a memorial service are often folks who have walkers or wheelchairs or whatever, and it was just very difficult for them. We wanted something that would be solid enough to take such things, but we didn't want to just pave it. We wanted to keep it where the rain would do what rain is supposed to do and go down. And eventually this was the conclusion, and it seems to have been working rather well. If we get enough Memorial Life memberships, eventually we hope to extend this kind of paving from here to the road to make it, it's relatively flat and easy, but again, if you're thinking wheelchairs, it would be nice to have it go all the way out. So we're always thinking ahead. Okay, now it's time to turn around and look at the rock. This terribly dried up, yucky, dead-looking stuff is called rock tripe lichen, because it kind of looks like tripe in a stew. The Cherokee word for it means pot scrapings, like you burned the stew at the bottom of the pot. But before we continue, let's remind you what lichen is. It is a combination of a fungus and an algae. what we call a symbiotic relationship, not parasitic, where one hurts the other to get its food. They work as a team. The fungus, and this is true of other kinds of lichen, like the light gray stuff on the tree over there. These are all lichen. They work the same way. The fungus provides structure. It attaches to the rock or the tree. The algae have chlorophyll. And as I hope you know, chlorophyll is what can perform the magic of taking the energy from sunlight and a little air and water and turning it into food, carbohydrates. And it shares the food with the fungus that is giving it a place to live. So it's a symbiotic relationship of a fungus and an algae. The mnemonic we use for the kids, but adults love it too, goes like this. Alice algae and Freddie fungus took a lichen to each other. And so they set up housekeeping together. Isn't it amazing how often the marriage seems to go on the rocks? Stupid, but you'll remember it. Okay, now, lichen grows very slowly. Well, first, it's going, when it rains, to open out and turn green, and you'll see the chlorophyll. If you're familiar with resurrection fern that often grows on rocks, on oak trees in the south, resurrection fern is all curled up, but when it rains, it opens and is gorgeous. This will do the same thing. If it were to rain, can you see that it is beginning to turn green? Oh, look at the green down here where it's falling. It will get a lot greener than that. It will get brighter green, but almost as deep as my shirt. It'll get almost like those leaves after a good rain. And that's the chlorophyll coming out and smiling in the sunshine and doing its thing. Now, lichen grows very slowly. Some lichens grow slower than others. The ones on the tree, a little faster. These, it takes, to grow an inch, takes 80 to 100 years. So if you look at some of the bigger ones, you know that they've been growing here for 500, 700 years. If you go down to cabin 1, there's another rock covered with this stuff, and some of those are like this big. You know they've been growing here for 800 to 1,000 years. So they're even more ancient than our beautiful wind-sheared white oaks. Both of these communities are reasons why the Land Trust felt that this was an appropriate place to do a conservation thing, to have it in trust, because these are very special communities, both the wind-sheared white oaks and such an ancient collection of the rock tripe lichen. The Cherokee, you've, I'm sure, heard of the Trail of Tears, where most of them were rounded up and forced marched to Oklahoma, those that didn't die along the way. But there were about 500 who hid out in the Smoky Mountains and didn't go on the hike to Oklahoma, and they became the basis of what they call the Eastern Band of Cherokee. But that first winter, it was a long, cold, hard winter, and this stuff, even in its green, filled out form, isn't terribly nutritious, somewhere between lettuce and cabbage maybe, but it fills the belly, and they apparently ate a lot of it that winter, and so the Cherokee have a rather fondness for this organism because it did save them that long, cold winter. All right, let's go up the stairs. Even people who've been this know. All right, this plant is called Galax, Galax, like the city in Virginia that's named for it. If it were just a little later in the spring, this flower, they would puff out into white flowers, and it would be what we call a bottle brush style flower. They're just lovely when the whole area is full of it. But the really special thing about Galax is that it will stay green and fresh right through Christmas and New Year's. Maybe it'll start turning a little bit red around the edges, maybe a bit maroon underneath. Well, red and green, what could be better? Early colonists would gather it for Christmas decorations, make their wreaths and so on out of it. Well, if a couple of families go out in the woods and gather some, no big deal, it's going to grow back. But as the population grew and we started developing nurseries that would have roadside stands where people could just drive up and buy it, those folks wanted to gather it in huge quantities to sell. And sometimes they did it on national forest land, which they're not supposed to do. And the rangers got a bit irritated, shall we say. Now, this story's going to have a happy ending. They found a spray that doesn't harm the plant and is totally invisible in natural light. They kind of knew where these folks would be going out. It had to be by where there was at least a dirt road that they could get their trucks and so on. So they went and sprayed the hillsides that they thought the nursery people were probably going to strip. And then in the fullness of time, they went down to the roadside stands. I forget whether it's infrared or ultraviolet light, but they shone their special light on it, and this spray showed up. So they said, we know where you got this stuff. You know you weren't supposed to get it there. We are confiscating the entire batch. I don't know whether they had to pay a fine as well, but a couple of years of having their whole stock confiscated after all the hard work they went to get it persuaded them. And so they began to understand that if they want to do this, they have to make a deal with a private landowner. You do not come on national forest land to do this. And so our communities of Galax have come back. And as you walk up the steps now, you're going to see all along the way a beautiful, happy community of Galax. Where the bottle brush was bottle brushing. Okay, we've come up from Memorial Garden, and now you know where you are again. And this, roughly, is where the stump was. With all the leaves on the trees, you can't see it. When I do this walk at Thanksgiving, you can see the tower. It's right there. And you can imagine what it took, that full stick of dynamite, to send it all the way over the tower from here. And that brings us back to where we started, more or less. It's been a pleasure. And I hope to see you at the mountain again one day. Now it's almost time for lunch.